Welcome to Perspectives with Mzu.
Welcome to Perspectives with Mzu. In today's podcast, I would like to take further a theme that I wrote on in my Daily Maverick article on land expropriation without compensation. For some time now, there's been a raging debate in South Africa on whether to expropriate or not, and there are contestations over whether Section 25 of the Constitution provides sufficient grounds for the state to expropriate land in public interests, with some arguing that there is no need for further amendments since the Constitution gives some guidelines on how the state or under what conditions the state can expropriate for public interest. And public interest in this case broadly defined as advancing the economic conditions of those who were deprived of economic opportunities under apartheid, those who were dispossessed, those without access to land and may need land. Now, the Constitution offers general provisions on protection of private property. Now, I'm not a constitutional law expert by any stretch. I reflect on the question of land expropriation without compensation from a political perspective. However, I think it would be good to make some reference to the Constitution and maybe to actually read the very contested clause, the property clause, which is Section 25, before I get to tease out some of the issues around my article on land expropriation without compensation. I'd like to read the relevant section and subsections of the Constitution. Section 25. No one may be deprived of property except in terms of law of general application, and no law may permit arbitrary deprivation of property. Property may be expropriated only in terms of law of general application for a public purpose or in the public interest, and subject to compensation, the amount of which and the time and manner of payment of which have either been agreed to by those affected or decided or approved by a court. The amount of the compensation and the time and manner of payment must be just and equitable, reflecting an equitable balance between the public interest and the interests of those affected, having regard to all relevant circumstances, including the current use of the property, the history of the acquisition and use of the property, the market value property, the extent of direct state investment and subsidy in acquisition and beneficial capital improvement of the property, and the purpose of the expropriation. For the purposes of this section, the public interest includes the nation's commitment to land reform and to reforms to bring about equitable access to all South Africa's natural resources. And the property is not limited to land. The state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to foster conditions which enable citizens to gain access to land on an equitable basis. A person or community whose tenure of land is legally insecure as a result of past racially discriminatory laws or practices is entitled, to the extent provided by an Act of Parliament, either to tenure, which is legally secure, or to comparable redress. A person or community dispossessed of property after 19 June 1913 as a result of past racially discriminatory laws or practices is entitled, to the extent provided by an Act of Parliament, either to restitution of the property or to equitable redress. No provision of this section may impede the state from taking legislative and other measures to achieve land, water, and related reform in order to redress the results of past racial discrimination, provided that any departure from the provisions of this section is in accordance with the provisions of Section 36, subsection 1. Parliament must enact the legislation referred to in subsection 6. So there we have it. It seems to me that the Constitution is quite clear as to the conditions under which the state may expropriate land. There are a number of conditions there, including fair, just, and equitable compensation, as well as other provisions. I'm not convinced that the ruling party should amend their constitution without having exhausted the provisions that are offered in the Constitution. I think to further erode property clauses has a number of dangers or carries a number of risks. And I want to kick off here by highlighting 3 risks that we are likely to see if the ruling party goes ahead with this provision. The first risk, in my view, is heightened political risk, that South Africa will face heightened political risk, which will deter further investments into the economy. Now, political risk is defined as any political event that can alter the value of an economic asset. This is a definition provided by Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group in their book titled The Fat Tail, where they discuss extensively the idea or the notion of political risk. Recently, Condoleezza Rice, the former chair of the National Security Advisors under George Bush's administration, and subsequently the Secretary of State under the same administration, with her colleague Emi Zagat, recently published a book titled Political Risk, and they look at the character of political risk. And this book is meant for business school students as well as practitioners in business. They define political risk as the probability that a political action could significantly affect a company's business. A political action could significantly affect a company's business. Some other thinkers, such as Robert McKellar, have defined political risk as potential harm to a business operation arising from political behavior. Underline the potential harm. Now, political risk is measured along 2 variables. It is measured in terms of the probability of realization, as well as the degree of harm and impact that a political behavior could incur or induce in the space within which businesses operate. So there are 2 components really, is the likelihood and the impact. Is a risk likely, and what impact it would have, especially on the business environment or the conditions under which businesses operate. So in the context of South Africa, we are going out there to attract foreign direct investment. We are convincing investors that we are open for business. We want money to flow into this economy, to contribute to gross fixed domestic investment, to build plants, to expand economic activities, to contribute to economic growth, to create jobs, to enable government to have a much broader base for tax, for government to be able to meet its socio-economic obligations, to deliver services to the general population, especially the poor. I don't know how any business in its right mind would invest in an economy that has high probability of risk, that has high likelihood of a risk with great impact. Because if you water down property rights, if you water down property clauses in the Constitution, you are not in any way contributing to building business confidence. Even if you dress this up as a transformational measure, because there is no evidence that the state, that government has fully explored its rights to undertake economic redress, to expropriate land with just and equitable compensation, or to convince those who may be holding on to assets in the economy, land in the economy unjustly, that is, land that is deemed to have been accumulated through dispossession, through illegitimate means under colonialism or under apartheid. The government has not fully explored its options within the given provisions of Section 25 as we read it. Instead, what we have seen through reports and also through the behavior of government in front of our eyes is that there has not been sufficient will to drive land reform. Many of the failures on land reform have had to do with weak institutional capabilities of the state. And in some instances, Black South Africans who have demonstrated means and ability to work the land, who are renting pieces of land, some of that land from the state, some of that land from white landowners, have not been allocated land by the state. Secondly, the state sits upon vast tracts of land owned by state-owned enterprises, owned by municipalities. And this land, the value of this land can be unlocked through sound redistributive mechanisms, with the state providing support to those who want to work the land productively. This has not happened. It is not clear how the state will rediscover political will, institutional wherewithal, and sound governance just by a stroke of a pen to amend the Constitution. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense because we've not dealt with some of the primary questions of state capabilities, of institutional capabilities of the state. The state has also not exercised the rights that are available to it to expropriate land. We've read this entire Section 25. The state has not taken bold and decisive steps to utilize the provisions that it has within the constitutional framework to undertake land reform, redress, and redistribution. So equity has been constrained in large part by the failure of the state to act in common interest or public interest. And finally, we've also seen instances where land or agricultural projects, as well as resources that were meant to go to beneficiaries of restitution or land reform broadly, going to the cronies of the ruling party. The Free Dairy Farm in Free State is one case in point, and that's just but one case. There have been anecdotal incidents in various provinces where schemes that were meant to benefit the poor have not generated benefits because the state has been poor at managing public resources for the benefit of genuine recipients of transformation. We also have smallholder farmers in former homelands who have no title deeds, who have no government support, who will never benefit from financial support from development finance institutions or the banks because they don't have titles. they are not properly supported. In fact, you see across parts of the Eastern Cape, large parts of the Eastern Cape, the former Transkei, there are no longer plantations that are happening. The plantation fields are fallow. Even when there's good rainfall, in instances where cooperatives come together to work the land, there is no support with respect to building of silos, to supporting with market linkages. These communities are basically left to fend for themselves without any means. Now, it's just inconceivable that the state will have the wherewithal by a stroke of the pen to amend the constitution to satisfy some visceral nationalistic sentiments, and that will be a food basket of the continent and the world by watering down the property clauses. It is simply unconvincing. Now, this is not to say that expropriation cannot be undertaken. In fact, the Constitution provides for that. The Constitution provides for that. And this is not to even suggest that that clause is static, but that it has not been utilized for us to have benefits of what its possible weaknesses could be and where it needs to be strengthened. Now, back to political risk. I suggest that one of the major fault lines or major weaknesses with this approach is that it will generate heightened political risk, and no investor in their right mind would invest in South Africa. In fact, we see this in cases where titles have been watered down or where individuals or households don't have titles to the land they occupy in the former homelands. There is no investment in those territories precisely or largely because the security of tenure is weak. So to amend the constitution in the manner that has been suggested is not with the intention of strengthening the security of land tenure, but it is to create ambiguities, or rather that's the net effect, even though those who are proponents of this move say or argue, perhaps they believe it, that this would strengthen land ownership by the dispossessed. It's difficult to believe this. The economic freedom fighters have been clear that the land should be owned by the state. When the state already owns land, the state-owned enterprises, and this land is not being put to productive use. Now, any investor that seeks to invest in South Africa would consider the future as highly risky because they will look at the probability of risk and the impact that such measures as amending the constitution to allow for expropriation without compensation would create. If we remember, a few years ago, South Africa discontinued bilateral investment treaties, which were weighted in favor of protecting investments, and they were less sensitive towards public interest. And South African government presented a sound case of why these bilateral investment treaties should be discontinued because were taken to international arbitration, extremely expensive. And other countries believe that these are necessary in developing countries because stuff happens, because property rights can be breached and investors would lose a lot of money as a result of the state's capricious behavior or capricious behavior of individuals or groups of people who don't respect property rights. And some of us argue that, well, the state is, government, South African government needs to move away from these bilateral investment treaties because they are expensive it's expensive to hire lawyers to represent government when they are taken to courts, international arbitration, and the South African government argue that the constitution offers stronger protective measures for both foreign investors and domestic investors. Now, this move to amend the constitution is it's a contradiction to that posture, because it plays right into the hands of those who've long argued that the bilateral investment treaties are a powerful form of protection for investors in South Africa. Now, you don't have bilateral investment treaties. You have people, politicians, who want to amend the constitution to effectively erode property rights, and you want to believe that this will be a magnet for foreign investors. I mean, this is really not a sound proposition. It's logically doesn't make sense, and in fact, it will, as I will note later, that in my view, I think it will harm the poor more, because if you don't have investments into the economy, you don't have the private sector sufficient to dent unemployment or to boost growth and to parlay resources that could go a long way in boosting public finances. And public finances are very important to drive delivery of public services. So the opposite direction we're going in is we are on a march towards high levels of indebtedness. And if we go through with these measures, it will be a matter of time before we bow down to the IMF or to the Chinese or to other external actors to beg for loans that could settle future generations for many years, and that could deny them the opportunities to access decent public health system, decent education, and decent quality of life in the country. Now, Ian Bremmer and Preston Kitt, in their book, which I cited earlier, which is titled Fat Tail, discusses political risk. They argue that one form of political risk, or one form of risk, such as, for an example, expropriation, has the potential to create or to multiply other risks, such as, for an example, financial risk. This is more so if we consider the relationship between land and finance capital. Much of productive land is bundled up with finance capital, and that expropriation creates significant financial risk. Could undermine the banking sector, and it could very well make credit unavailable in the economy. It will unleash the animal spirit, in a negative way, or in the opposite direction than investing. It will make it highly risky to put money into the economy. Now, the second negative effect of expropriation without compensation, is that this could erode trust between government and business, as well as between government and society, by the way. We are in a state of very low trust in society. We are a low trust society. The tensions in society are widening. Tensions or lack of trust between government and business, between government and society, between business and society, and within society. My observation is that we trust each other less. We don't believe what the government says or the promises that government makes, because they have breached these many times, and corruption has dampened risk. It has perverted the relationship between government and society. Now, if you look at private property is very sacred. Private property, protected by the rule of law, protected by the Constitution, safeguards an intimate space that individuals, households exist within. And to the extent that this intimate space is protected, and that this intimate space is deemed decent, and that the titles or the title deeds that underpin this intimate space are valuable, and are of productive nature, and that they can form a bequest to future generations. It enables households, individuals and households, to be more actively engaged in society as confident citizens, and also to be part of the public realm. It gives them a greater stake in the economy, in society, and it creates a positive social contract with those who govern. Now, erosion of private property does exactly the opposite. It makes individuals unsafe in their intimate private space. What we ought to be doing more is to extend titles, is to create conditions that would make those titles valuable, is to give people an opportunity to enjoy decent homes, individuals to enjoy homes that are safe, homes that are decent, to be able to raise their children, to feel secured, to have a garden, to be able to feel confident and have a sense of esteem as human beings. In short, property, title deeds, and decent homes that affirm human dignity, and that make people to participate, or enable people to participate meaningfully in the public realm. And in a broader sense, this is also about eliminating socioeconomic inequalities in society, empowering individuals with a capacity to participate in economic activities. And land, in my view, is an important asset, or can be an important asset, because it provides individuals and households assets that they can leverage for wealth creation, for material or economic advancement, and certainly gives their children and future generation confidence as individuals and human beings in society. Now, I don't see how these amendments that are proposed will restore human dignity when there has been a failure to restore human dignity, to abuse public resources, where government has abused public resources, from local government to provincial government to national government to state-owned enterprises. I don't know how a stroke of a pen to change or to erode property rights will all of a sudden ignite some fire of enlightenment on the part of government to be now transformational in its approach to the Black majority in South Africa. I think what we need more is better imagination about how we use existing resources, how we use the existing legislative instruments to drive long-term social and economic change. And importantly, I think we need to rebuild this trust between government and society. And I don't think this will be achieved by simply changing the constitution. The private sector, too, has significant role to play in contributing to social and economic change. In my view, it should be driven more by an enlightened self-interest, and it should demonstrate deep commitment to transformation through deeds, not rhetoric, not gimmicks, not corporate social investment programs that they are not committed to, not through BEE fronting, not by short-circuiting the more substantive forms of broad-based empowerment by opting to work with a few connected individuals, those who are connected to the ruling party. I think the private sector needs to be a lot more conscious of the urgency of overcoming the existing socio-economic challenges in society, as well as committing itself to genuine equity programs and to create goodwill in society, to create goodwill amongst the Black majority, amongst the Black middle class, those who still feel that there is a glass ceiling in corporates, that an old white boys network still rule the rooster in the top echelons of the corporate, in executive, in exco, in boards, etc. So there is a need to create a genuine spirit of inclusiveness, because it's an illusion that things will remain as they are, that somehow we'll forget that we are unequal, that race-based inequalities still prevail in society. We'll somehow forget about history. Our children will not. The generations to come will not, and may just very well be more radical than the current generation and prefer a more chaotic way of driving change. And I think we have an opportunity today to put our heads together, to put our hearts together and explore genuine pathways to creating the kind of change where we all can feel a part of this economy, where there is a sense of inclusiveness in the economy, and where there is a shared commitment to overcome poverty, to overcome socio-economic inequalities, and where there is a government that is up to the task, that doesn't redistribute resources to the pockets of the few, but to really change the socio-economic face of the country. I really think we need to rebuild trust. Government and business should work together to explore a genuine roadmap for change. And I think we need to be honest about building this economy that is inclusive. Because if we fail, the future generations will judge us very harshly for lack of imagination and courage to take bold steps towards the kind of change that could make all of us better off. It simply is not looking good that you have a tiny minority owning the lion's share of a country's wealth. It is very bad that you have a government that has so much going for it, that presides over such a relatively healthy economy in the African continent, modern economy, that has fairly developed institutions, and it's failing to meet its social obligations. And it's also just not right to have a business sector that is driven by selfish transactional interests and fails to look into the future, fails to be driven by a multi-generational perspective. The final risk that I see, or the effect of this debate on land expropriation without compensation, is loss of moral legitimacy for the ruling party, the government that is in power. And I think this path could very well generate seeds of tyranny in the future. I think the ruling party is shooting itself in the foot. I think they are working against their own interests. And I think there's an opportunity to take an about 10 and manage the process of change in a much better way than is currently the case. We need to wake up from the slumber or from illusions of nirvana through constitutional amendments, because it simply will not happen. I think there are opportunities, though, in this debate. I think maybe it's a good thing that we are debating this intensely, especially for the purpose of generating urgency about transformation, about social change, about paying attention to the millions of South Africans who still are not living in decent homes, blighted by unemployment, socioeconomic inequalities, young people who are a wasteland, and rural communities that are not progressing, that are not developing economically. And I think we should focus the debate on this. We should place at the center, not the property class, as I argued in my piece. We should not speak a lot about or be concerned as much about assuaging the interests of a tiny property lot. I mean, the agriculture sector in South Africa benefited hugely in the past, from back in the colonial era under the Union of South Africa, through the Land Bank Act in 1912, Native Land Act in 1913, Urban Areas Act, and various apartheid legislations that made the white minority wealthy and to accumulate social capital that they could then distribute to the future generation of their kin in the form of securing them better amenities in life, better quality education, and better life opportunities. And the agricultural sector, as a sector, I think has benefited from the largesse of the South African apartheid government through subsidies, through protected marketing boards, through extension services, through various special arrangements. And I think it is a time that we do consider a bigger picture, that there is a bigger picture out there. There is an opportunity to create or to maximize wealth creation for the greatest number of people than a tiny minority. And this, by the way, is a feature of other sectors of the economy. And also, I mean, the agriculture sector has special features such as high levels of concentration in the agribusiness value chain, where you will not see, or you will see really very few Black players participating in that cloistered space. So if there is any opportunity in this debate, it is that we can confront these realities head on and be honest about creating new possibilities for change. So my article in the Daily Maverick explores these questions and tries to provide a balanced perspective between the need and the urgency for redressing historical injustices and cautioning against taking a reckless path to dealing with these challenges. And I think there are better ways to achieve better ends than what is proposed in the form of land expropriation without consultation. All right, I'll leave my podcast for today there. And in the next podcast, I will be having another guest who we will talk about a range of issues affecting society, the role of tech in social change. Until next time, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Perspectives with Mzu.